Linda. I love being called illustrious. Illustrious. So I don't know exactly what International Crime Month means. I just was thinking maybe this is the month to commit it, if you're thinking about it. But I sort of think every month you need to read at least one crime novel, nonfiction book, something like that, right? You know, when Joyce Carol Oates was here, somebody asked her, because she's not like really an official crime writer, and she said there are no books without crimes, some sort of crime. And I always, I got quoted somewhere, I mouthed off because somebody was denigrating crime fiction, and I said, oh, so you don't like American Tragedy, Crime and Punishment, Lolita, and the list kept going. Now, so in any case, I'm just going on for a moment, but I'm really happy to be here. My friend Cheryl Tan and Marco Malvaldi, who is here from Italy and here for 1 week, and he said it's his first trip to New York. I'm really sorry about the weather today. You know, I mean, it's a little in advance. It looks like it's going to storm, right? But anyhow, let me start just to say that we are going to have a conversation, but I've asked Cheryl and Marco just to read for about a minute and a half so that you can get a flavor of the things they've done. Let me give you a little background about these two extraordinary people, who I would say are seriously more illustrious than I am. Cheryl Tan, who I met at Yaddo. Think of Cheryl now as the sort of unofficial queen of Yaddo somehow, or I don't know. She's, everybody, anytime I meet anyone from Yaddo, they say, oh, so, do you know Cheryl? So, yes, so Cheryl's the author of a terrific memoir, Tiger in the Kitchen, which is a memoir of food and family. And won an award recently, but you'll have to tell me.
New York Magazine.
Oh, New York Magazine. Okay. Cheryl's a former staff writer at the Wall Street Journal. Her works appeared in the Times, the Washington Post. She's written for Marie Claire, Newsweek, Bon Appetit. She's well written and well read. She's also, but it's not just Yaddo. She's been at Ragdale, a guest at Ragdale, Jurassic, Ledig House, and the studios at Key West. Born and raised in Singapore, which is basically why you're here tonight. And you came to the U.S. at 18, I believe, and you are working on your new novel, or your first novel?
Yes.
Cheryl's not another one of these people who's not an official, I would say, crime writer, but she wrote a great crime sort of noir story for something I did, which has caused me some issues, which is the Marijuana Chronicles. And she is the editor and contributor to Singapore Noir, which is part of the amazing, Akashic Noir series, which is just out and is in a really terrific collection, which she'll tell you about. Marco Malvaldi was born in Pisa, and I read his book last week, Game for Five. They sent it to me, which was really nice of your publisher. And it's the first in the Bar Lumi series. He's also an award-winning writer. He's written, I think, how many more books in that series? 6, okay. Plus a historical mystery, plus a guidebook to Pisa, which, and we're all coming to visit you there. Anyhow, right? Okay.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you. He's won the Isola de Elba Award, correct? Am I saying that correctly? And the Castiglione Prize for his crime novels. And so I'd like you to welcome both of these people. I think we'll start with Cheryl. We'll read something from her Singapore Noir. Yes? Okay, thanks.
Hi. So Singapore Noir is a project that I really love, and I have really wanted to do for a while. Okay.
Yeah.
And so I'm really excited to be sharing with you. I was born in Singapore, and the thing that I hate about being here, I've lived here for 20 years now, is every time I bring up Singapore, people think, oh, it's so boring. Or, people are so law-abiding, they listen to all the rules. And I've always thought, well, that's not really true. Like, if you go to Singapore, you kind of know that there are really dark pockets there. So I was very excited to do this. Each story is set in a different neighborhood in Singapore. There are a lot of prostitutes in here. One is even named Cheryl. That's not in my story. And I have no idea why that's the case. But I'm going to read a bit from my story, which is set in a bit of Singapore that almost no tourists go to. It's very old. It's old Singapore. It's by the water. It's near where I grew up. In this area, there are a lot of fishermen and also these what we call kilongs. They're like these old fisheries on stilts. And the stilts are built to kind of trap fish, and this is where like a lot of the fish, the huge fish in like restaurants come from. And I've always been fascinated with this part of Singapore because it's so old, and most people don't know about it. And I've also wondered, you know, life is so boring on a kelong. All you do is sit there and wait for the fish to swim into your traps. What can happen? So this is kind of a story that's set there. Monsoon season had just started, which was both okay and not so okay for fishing. Sometimes the stormy waters pulled flotillas of tiger groupers and cobia into the kelong traps. But some days, all he and Siva hauled in were nets of shrimp and tiny crabs. No matter how many of those you caught, no point la. The Chinese restaurants only paid big bucks for large fish. Nice ones that they can display in fish tanks. Ma had just scolded him for squatting and smoking like a samseng the week before, when she suddenly showed up again in her new second-hand Corolla to spy on him. It was true that Aming never used to do it until he started copying his army mates. But once she scolded him, ayo, he found himself doing it all the time. He couldn't understand his mother sometimes. She always said that she came by without calling first because she happened to be in the neighborhood. But hello, Aming was her son. Wouldn't he know that she lived in Faber Crescent all the way on the other side of the island? Sometimes Aming couldn't believe how dude she thought he was. Of course he wasn't smart like Along, can go to university in Australia and all, but she should at least know that he wasn't stupid. After last week, Aming started really enjoying squatting on the jetty smoking. He liked imagining the look on his mother's face if she pulled up in her Corolla at that exact moment. The thought of that made each puff all the more shook. Spotting the girls made him get up though. There were two, one big, one smaller, skinny beanpoles with long pale legs. The big one had a long tidy ponytail. The little one of those Japanese doll haircuts. Even before they got close, Aming could see how pretty they were. He could tell that they were sisters. Same button nose, same slightly crooked smile, same cheeks the color of young dragon fruit. They even walked the same, each turning out her feet just slightly. They must have come from the village hawker center. Each clutched a clear plastic bag of sugarcane juice, jabbed with a neon pink straw. From their slippers, Aming guessed that they lived close enough to walk. He tried to recall if he had seen them before. He didn't think so. Girls weren't that common on this jetty, so he was sure he would have noticed. A little farther away, yes, near the government holiday chalets on Strawberry Hill. Sometimes at night, you might see the Malay ladyboys pop up and loiter a little, some of them looking for a break from walking, some just looking for a good spot for their clients. But mostly, all you saw on this jetty were the morning fishermen, and the few kelong oldies left, and Aming. Thank you.
Hello. My first novels are all based on an investigator which is a sort of a genius because he's in fact a composite investigator, like Nero Wolfe, which is in fact two investigators, the detective European part and the action, the American part, actually in Nero Wolfe. I have followed a different way, following an American poet, Edgar Lee Masters, who said that the genius is age and strength, that you have to be both aged and young in order to be a genius. My investigator is a composite investigator, a young bartender, former mathematician, and 4 retired person. The diagnosis and the therapy. The one that understands that something is not going on the right way, and the one who understands how the thing could be fixed. And I just described these 4 old men. The only pleasant thing to do at exactly 2 in the afternoon on a day in mid-August, when the air you're breathing is liquid and you're trying not to think that it's still 6 or 7 hours to dinner time, it's to go to a bar and have a drink with a few friends. You sit down on one of the tables outside, adjust your pants, the crotch of which is so wet it needs wringing, cool off for 10 seconds and magically become yourself again. Whoever in your group is feeling in good form goes inside to order from the counter, because when the barman saw you, he glared at you, and there's no washing glasses, or rather one glass, the same one for the past 5 minutes. And if nobody goes inside to order, forget it. The important thing, though, is that there's a beat of a breeze. That wisp of wind, just strong enough to lift your shirt away from your skin a little, gently count your vertebrae, and cool the gaps between your toes, to which your plastic flip-flops have given very little relief thus far, but not so strong as to ruffle the hair you've brushed over a bald spot. The iodine smell of the sea breeze unblocks your nostrils and persuades you to breathe, and by the time the hero who has taken on the job of waiter returns with the drinks and the cards, you're feeling in a good mood again, and the afternoon has suddenly gotten a hell of a lot shorter. Such things are pleasant at the age of 20. At 80, they are the salt of life.
I was thinking today, because obviously I knew I was going to be here with Cheryl and Marco, and the idea of international crime. And so I'm going to ask each of you, and there's no real answer to this. It's just your opinion about what it might be. There's a real tradition in crime writing in America. It's Chandler, Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett. So we have this sort of tradition that American crime writers work out of. And so I wondered if you could say that there is, or how there might be, a tradition, from your country that related to this in some way. Marco, do you want to? Oh, sure.
Yeah, sure. Oh, well, in my homeland, it is really, really difficult to write a crime novel because of a peculiar characteristic of the person. From the country where I come, nobody does his own business. So it's really, really difficult to do something that's not according to law. In this sense, it's a sort of you're forced to write a classic crime novel instead of an international crime novel, because usually classical crime novels do take place in a limited chunk of space and time, usually a weekend, in which you need a castle, some barons or earls or something like that, and their servants. A little bit of hunting won't hurt, at least for humans. And so it's the kind of crime novel that's better sets to this kind of situation. And it's interesting, it's funny to joke, to play about this, about the fact that everyone knows everything about everyone except for himself.
Yeah.
So the funny thing is to develop a novel starting from this assumption.
So would you say then that Italian crime writers look at the general tradition, that comes out of all crime writing, or like American crime writers? Because the joke you made was sort of Agatha Christie, right? So that's one kind of traditional crime writing, and then there's the hard-boiled crime writing, and so anyway, so does it mean then that there is this international style that we all adhere to?
Well, I think that there are two kinds of international styles. The one from the big city and the one from the little countryside. Because if you get a big city, you can write a very good thriller. you can have people moving, you can have international affairs, you can have all the things that you need in order to write these kind of novels. Well, if you've got a small village in the countryside, preferably in England, okay, but even in Italy or France it can work. You can do different things. There are two kinds of international styles. The American one, I think, needs the big town. Like, for example, in Italy, Maurizio De Giovanni develops his stories in Naples, which is a big and messy town.
Yeah.
While me, I came from a small village near Pisa, and I settled my story in little villages.
Yeah. I'm going to get Cheryl saying that. So I think there would be some American thriller writers that would argue with you, like Karen Slaughter, who's been here, who writes really intense, kind of hard-boiled thrillers set in a tiny southern town. So, no, I'm just saying this because you can merge these things, right? I mean, they're kind of hybrids, but it's interesting that, and I want to continue that. But Cheryl, how would you see it?
Well, this book has a little bit of both, because Singapore, if you've never been there, is this very urban city. It's very tiny. It's incredibly densely populated. They're very wealthy people. They're very poor people, and they're all kind of mashed together in this thing. And so that's like a great setting. There's so many stories there. Very dark stories that happen there. But then also, apart from that, you have these little pockets of sort of like where the cozy mysteries might be set. So you have a little bit of both. But I think what sort of differentiates a lot of the Singapore crime stories I've seen is very often, it's funny, the ones I've read, especially one of the writers in here has a terrific series out that's just been published in the States. Her name is Avidya Yu, and she writes these cozy mysteries called Auntie Lee's Delights or Desserts. And so the mysteries tend to be a little bit food focused sometimes, because Singapore is very food obsessed. And then there are also the mysteries that are, a lot of them tend to have some sort of supernatural element, a little bit, black magic, or like a feng shui master, or because that's a huge part of Singapore culture. We talk about people in our lives like this a lot. Having a feng shui master come in to cleanse a room, and then while he's there, he kind of solves a crime. That's actually one of the stories in here. A feng shui detective whose job it is to cleanse the room, but then he's like, wait, this guy was killed, and that's how it starts.
Let me move your couch here. And, so it seems, now you just listed, kind of thriller material, and then you had mystical, that sort of thing. So, and then Marco talked about the big town thriller, and then the Agatha versus a sort of what we call cozy, like Agatha Christie. So what I'm hearing then is, and I thought of, while you were talking, I was thinking about Umberto Eco, The Name of the Rose, which is a whole other thing, right? So that, I wonder, and I've been reading, everybody here has probably been reading a lot of Scandinavian thrillers because they're the rage in the last, decade. So it is like there is becoming this kind of international style that pulls together all of these various elements, I think, I mean, you started, Marco, by saying that your detective was a composite.
Yeah.
Do you see your barman as he's an amateur sleuth? So does he come? I mean, what were there traditions that you looked at?
Well, apart from Mickey Mouse, that is the most. It's a non-professional investigator is something that I ever liked, because a non-professional investigator hasn't got some duties and some bounds that the professional investigator for sure has, and this allows more freedom and a little bit more of interesting things to go on. The fact that he's a bartender is not like any other job, because the bar in Italy is the only one democratic institution, is the only one place where everyone goes and everyone is treated in the same way, no matter if he's a professor, if he's a plumber, or a horse driver, or something like that. Everyone in the bar are equal.
Right.
And this is a very important thing. The second important thing is that the bar is a hub, is a place where many people go, many people can meet and exchange what they know. So usually information diffused by means of light occasional acquaintances, not by deep friends. Because if I am a deep friend of you and a deep friend of you, and it's very likely that you both are deep friends. So if I say something to you and to her,
Right.
the information will not diffuse. But if I say something in a bar, a bunch of person will know and will diffuse it to person I'm not aware of their existence.
Yeah.
So it's a wonderful place in order
Yeah.
to investigate.
Well, think, all novels, let's say, I was going to say all crime novels, but I mean, it's not all novels, but, a sense of place, of creating a specific locale, a time, a feeling, and Cheryl, because you don't come out of a crime background, and yet you found your way into a lot of the, and I'm wondering, I'm a little all over the place, but I think we'll just think about this as a conversation where we do go all over, and then I'll let you contribute to that. But what drew you to crime?
Well, I love this series. I had read several of the books in the NOIR series, and so when I met the publisher, I said, "How come there's no Singapore NOIR?" He said, "I don't know any Singapore writers," and I was like, "Well, you do now." So that's literally how this came about. And it's funny, but a lot of the writers in here, many of them, these are many of Singapore's best writers have contributed a story to this, and many of them had not written NOIR before. And so we had a lot of conversations about what NOIR was, and because I realized through talking to them, and in the aftermath, the book launched in Singapore a month ago, that Singaporeans have not traditionally written about crime a lot because they worry about the impression that gives that they commit crime, perhaps, or they have those minds that might commit crime, because Singapore is very straight-laced. And this only really hit home when I did a TV interview when I was there about a week and a half ago, and the producer called me 2 days before the interview, and he had read the book, and he was very concerned. He was like, these stories seem very real. Where do they come from? And I was like, well, it's fiction. And they were like, well, but they seem very real. Are you sure none of your writers have done anything? And I'm like, I'm pretty sure that none of them have ever killed anyone. I don't know. And then it occurred to me, okay, so that's why, and that's why these writers, they're Singapore's best, but a lot of them had not written this kind of story before because they thought maybe it was a little bit taboo, perhaps, or it showed a dark side of their mind that they didn't want exposed. But it's all here.
No, that's really interesting. I was going to ask you about if most of the writers or any of the writers had written noir or crime before, which now you've answered. But you bring up something else just now, which I think, and I want to ask this of Marco as well, which is a notion, which is something also that like PEN, which I'm part of, talks about all the time, which is censorship. And which is a big international subject and topic, but I want to personalize it. So when you write, and either one of you can answer this, do you censor yourself, particularly when you're writing about violent crime, which will lead us into a discussion of sex and why there's not enough sex in crime fiction. But in the meantime, do you censor yourselves what you will or will not write, generally?
Well, I have a very odd method of writing. I've tried to be the person who wakes up every day and writes 1,500 words a day. And I've done that, and then I look at it and I'm like, it's crap. So what I found works better for me is if I think about something for a very long time, and I think about it, and I scribble little notes here and there, and then I sit down and I lock myself in a room and I just write the whole thing. And so that way I'm not censoring myself. Because I know if I think about it too hard, I am going to censor myself. I'm going to worry, what's Auntie Alice going to think if I write a sex scene, or and so I try to create this cocoon in which I'm not censoring myself, and then I'll go back and revise. I'll pull back or I'll change things.
Why? Okay, I just have to explore that a little further. Why, if you're thinking about it and then you create the cocoon, would you be necessarily less self-censoring? What I mean, because we all, we all, there are moments when when you pull out of your work because you step back and you go, oh, like I've just, or you look at something. I'm just pushing your
When I've
answer.
done it, I've written very fast. And so I think I just finished my novel, and a huge chunk of it, I wrote over 3 weeks. Like I wrote 40,000 words in 3 weeks. And so it's basically, I slept like 4 hours a night, and basically it just all came out. And I mean, I'm not saying it was good. My poor agent it was inflicted on her, but I'm not saying it was good, but it was there. The bones of it was there, and everything I wanted to say was there. And then I went back and I cleaned it up.
Okay, but you wouldn't, okay, we'll come back to that. I want to ask Marco to talk about that issue of censorship and self-censorship. I can't apply it in a huge way to, let's say, all international writers, but it is something that has come up at Penn so many times, and in a general way about the world censoring books, but I'm asking you to personalize that.
Well, for me, my stage is very similar. The first stage, I think, to novel much time, because I've learned that, and without writing down anything, because I learned this way, the good ideas remain stuck to the brain and the other are flushed away. But when I begin to write, I'm sort of a reader of myself. I write exactly what I would like to read in that moment. So I write for myself, and I try to enjoy, to maximize the pleasure that I get by writing. That is the pleasure that I get by reading. So if I write something, then I let it just some days resting, then reread it again, and I must admit 1 over 2 times it's something that has got to be flushed down because it's something that happens after for me. Mm-hmm. After I have written, I judge myself, and then I say, okay, let's try to see what I've written.
Yeah.
And well, it's an advantage to be a writer because you can hide your corpse very easily if you're self-aware enough.
I think my question was a different question than anybody answered, but it's okay because it brings up the whole writing process.
We don't want to answer.
No, it's okay. And I actually don't want you to. So, but I'm thinking, if people, some of you I know were here when Joyce Carol Oates spoke, and she talked about just what you said and just what you both said, which is walking around with your book in your head before you start to write, and rather than, there are what I call automatic writers who sit down and they just start writing. And Joyce Carol Oates said what you said, wanders around with it and then, just works. So there's the whole process but what I was also getting to was something about crime, specifically, people believe what they read, so fiction is a kind of odd place because people think somehow that you're always writing about yourself, right? So when Cheryl said earlier, when she introduced her book, and she said there's even a prostitute in it named Cheryl, I thought, well, so everyone will now think Cheryl was a prostitute, and I'm sure she was extremely successful. But
as a writer,
yeah. But I do think there is that thing. There's the 2 parts which Marco talks about. There's the letting it all explode on the page, and then there's the critical part where you come back. But in writing crime, this is going back to my question a little. Writers write a lot of violence. There's a lot of violence in crime, but maybe I'm going to not have you talk about your self-censorship. How about instead, because Cheryl brought it up, about Singapore, do you think, let's say there's less violence, since America is always criticized for its violence, in the writing from your country or yours versus American crime writing or American writing in general? I know that's a tough one, and I kind of snuck it in there. I don't know.
Well, it depends. This answer suits for all, of course. But I think that it depends on what is your real purpose. Because sometimes your purpose is to investigate on the crime, and then the way in which you describe the violence is functional. There is another kind of crime in which you want to know why that person committed that crime. So in a sense, you kill the victim and you take a little bit, you enjoy it a little bit, I must say. That's for my part. I usually, when I choose my victims, I choose very similar to person I know, and that unfortunately I can't kill because there is something like the law in Italy for someone else at least. But I enjoy that part of course it's a joke, it's on paper, but if you're interested in why that person has been removed, let's say, you describe it in another way. You just describe when you kill him or her. In another sense, you describe the after, and there's the huge bunch of novels with autopsy, anatomical details, and all that sort of which is more cold, more precise, but you're interested in what came after. Instead, I'm interested in what came before.
Okay, sure.
I would say, there's not a whole lot of homicide in Singapore, especially compared to the U.S. So when something happens, we talk about it for years. There's a church in downtown Singapore where a cook killed her husband and turned him into curry, and we still talk about it. This happened 25 years ago. So there's not a lot of violence in here, and I think that might be a reflection of that. Perhaps people just aren't faced with it until you go to the movies and you see an American film or something. And so a lot of, but they're very creative ways in which people are killed in here, which to me is fascinating. One of the stories, it's sort of a, I mentioned black magic before, but black magic is at play, and something happens. So Esther Roseanne, if you're an Esther Roseanne fan, has a lovely, lovely story in here. She's a big Singapore fan, and that also is another sort of creative way of dealing with a problem. So I think if you want to compare it with American crime, crime fiction, this probably does have a lot less violence in it.
Mm-hmm. Well, for most of these people, you said it's maybe their first foray into the field.
Yeah.
And were they excited to do that, or a little scared to do it? You said.
I think a little bit of both. Some of these are, like I mentioned, they're Singapore's best writers. 3 of them have won the Singapore Literature Prize, which is the equivalent of the Pulitzer in Singapore. And so they really have reputations at stake here. So if they go out and they write this sort of very sexy, steamy, violent story, everyone's going to talk about it for 20 years in Singapore. They're not going to talk about the book that won the prize. They're going to talk about this story. So perhaps but I don't think so. Like one of them actually, Simon Tay wrote this wonderful story that was really sort of out there, and everyone who's read it has been very surprised in Singapore, and they've kind of brought it up. So I've been really excited. I think they kind of took the ball and they ran with it. And another thing that I'm very proud of in here is that Singapore is a country where it's still like gay rights they're non-existent really, and one of the writers in here, she's an incredibly prolific playwright in Singapore, and she was about to have a book of her plays published, and the publisher said, we have to take out this play because it has 2 lesbians in it. He's like, 1 is fine, but 2 is too much. We have 4 gay characters in this book. So this is creating some waves in Singapore. So I'm kind of proud of them for just sort of letting go and just sort of writing about life as it is.
It's interesting to think that how many Akashic Noir books have there been, and how much of an impact can they have? I mean, they're all wonderful books, and some are more popular than others, but how much impact can they have in the United States versus how much impact a book can have in Singapore, right?
Yeah.
Going back to the,
Yeah.
and it sort of goes back to Marcus talking about the small town. So Yeah, anyway, there was something else that I wanted to bring up, which is, so, you know, I think of Cheryl as an American, I just do, but I know that you know, obviously that you were formed by your culture, and so you are kind of a, you know, you're a composite like Marco's, you know, protagonist. And for both of you, I wanted to ask you, though, what you felt the advantage and disadvantage would be, or what they are, to being, let's say, in quotes, a foreign writer. The advantages and disadvantages of being a foreign writer for the, you know, publishing in the U.S.
Well, I think that what you don't know stimulates your curiosity. So if you live in New York, probably reading only novels settled in New York, after a little bit of some 5-10 years, you may get a little bit bored. And I personally love many novels from, for example, from Scandinavian writers. I have never been to Scandinavia apart from having landed in Oslo one time, so I don't think it's valid. But thanks to this novelist, I know something about Scandinavian way of life. So I think that curiosity may be a good engine for if you don't know something, you just maybe you just want to try. I'm quite curious about, for example, about Singapore, because I know very few things about. I think the only thing I know for sure is the name means 4 lions. Is that right?
Lion City.
Okay, perfect. It wasn't correct. Even this. You can imagine.
We learned something today.
And so I think that this may be I would be very, very surprised if these novels encounter a huge success. Not for the fact they are not beautiful; they are wonderful, of course. But I'm speaking about mine. Huh?
Yeah.
Well, I hope there's enough curiosity, and I think Italy is one of the places that you think you know and you actually don't know until you don't live there for these 50, 60 years. So
That long? We have to be there
Wow.
for 50 or 60 years. Yeah, I think one of the great things that all novels, of course, do is take you to another place and another world. Cheryl, you're...
Yeah, and I think it's definitely the same, that's true for Singapore. I think a lot of people here, when they know about Singapore, they know a few things. Caning, chewing gum, strict laws. And so people tend to not go beyond that. So for me, what's great about being a Singaporean writer, but writing here, is you know, all the things that I grew up with and I take completely for granted. Sometimes I'll, you know, tell someone something like, oh yeah, this thing that happens in Singapore, and they're like, what? And it's completely wacky and crazy. They've never heard of it before, and I'm like, I should write something about this, or that's a scene, or whatever. And it's something that doesn't happen in New York because it's very uniquely Singapore. There are a lot of details like that in here. Like one of the stories is about a taxi uncle. We call everyone uncle in Singapore, and taxis are ubiquitous. So you get in and you're like, hi uncle, you know. And so this taxi uncle keeps like a little miniature coffin on his dashboard with the bone of a dead child. And that's an old tradition in Singapore. And it's the child is you're carrying the child's spirit with you to protect you. And so it's little details like that where it's like, oh yeah, you know, the bone of the dead child. But here it's like, what? So it's completely rich details, I think, that that pack into a story and make it interesting to an American audience.
Absolutely. I was going to ask you about language and translation, and you write in English, but all of that. But I'm going to turn it over if people have questions generally for these two writers. Otherwise, I'm going to keep asking questions and babble. So yes, Noreen.
Cheryl, I was curious, did you know before everyone turned in their stories that 4 of the writers would choose to make gay characters, or was that just coincidence?
It was coincidence, but one of them I sort of knew that he would probably have a gay writer in here. He's Singapore's first openly gay writer, so it was very important to me to include him. And then the others just kind of surprised me. Actually, if I sit down, when I was sitting there counting it, I think there might actually be 6 if you count like much more peripheral characters. So, I don't know. The book has been banned so far in Singapore. It's on the bestseller list in Singapore's big bookstore. So clearly, you know, Singaporeans the public is eating it up, I hope.
Yes.
Did you notice a difference between the non-Singaporean writers and their perspective on Singapore as opposed to the Singaporean writers? I mean, can they be categorized that easily?
I think so. I've been criticized a bit in my own country for being a little bit too Americanized. When my first book came out, A Tiger in the Kitchen, it was about a year that I spent traveling back to Singapore to learn how to cook. And I remember reading some of the Twitter remarks, and people were like, oh, she's writing poetry about our food. Is it really that special? And I'm like, well, yes, it is. Not for you if you eat it every day, but like, I don't have my grandma cooking for me every day. And so I think being so far away, I think we look at this little red dot, which is what we call it, with like a lot of distance, and we're able to see it in a different way when our noses aren't so pressed up against it. We're able to sort of see the bigger picture, perhaps, want to push the envelope a little bit more. And I think it's kind of refreshing to see a little bit of that there too. Singaporeans are very well traveled, so they're not just stuck there, and the writers who are there are really trying to make a change.
So, Cheryl, are you worried that you'll be held responsible if the crime rate goes up in the
Well, I might be held responsible if any of my writers get jailed. No, I don't think so. I think Singaporeans are generally very law-abiding, so they're not going to read this as some blueprint to go out and kill someone. And even if they wanted to, it's kind of hard to summon up black magic, I think. But
I was kidding. I do a real question, but so the tradition of the crime novel as approaching crime as a social issue, I think is kind of a big trend, and maybe even European crime or international crime has more of that, I think, than the U.S. So I'm going to put that out there. Do you think that that the U.S. does it more, that European crime fiction does it more? Is there a tradition that you're aware of in your own home countries?
Well, I can say this, that many of crime writers from the far east came from an American way of life. For example, the Inspector Chen Kao by I don't remember now the name of this. He's a Chinese writer that went off from China at the age of 22, now lives and teaches in the United States, and began to write crime novels after 20 years of life abroad. I think it's very interesting, and it's correct what Cheryl did say. You realize the way in which your nation, the way the place in which you grow up, sees crime after living it, and then by comparison. So in that case, you're able to say very interesting things because you know in which direction to move. And at that point, the question became interesting because you are not going to exaggerate. You're not going to say useless or well-known things, but you just give the interesting, the different, the real juice of the real taste of the story. So I think it's important to go abroad. For me, it has been. I realized many things about the Italian way of life after leaving Italy and after living in the Netherlands first and in Japan after. And if you live in different countries, you realize many of the things you just don't give up nothing when you live in your own country. So it's fundamental. This kind of.
Yeah, and those aren't those don't, your stories aren't any less Italian if you're overseas, or they're just different. Or
Were you asking us? Were you hinting at morality in some way? Like, I kind of heard. I don't know if anybody else heard this. That possibly non-American writers had a higher moral plane that they were existing on in some way. Did anybody else hear that, or a little bit?
Imagine more as a tool to examine society. Okay, maybe I was, but I mean, yes.
well, I think in this case, because crime doesn't happen so rarely in Singapore. When it does happen, it's always a moment to pause and kind of, kind of reflect. And I think that's sort of the case in here too. A lot of the stories in here kind of touch on current affairs too. Sex scandals, maid abuse is a huge topic in Singapore. It has been in recent years. And two of the stories are about maids. Have maids in them as central characters. So, so I think, sort of perhaps, I'm not sure if we're more moral but I think it's definitely when stuff like that happens and it's so striking, you take that as a moment to kind of go, okay, what does this say about our society? Where are we going?
Well, I think, in your book, Game for Five, Marco, that, it's basically someone is, if I'm not wrong, being, looking at somebody's life, a victim's life to examine it. And I think there is a big moral question involved there.
Yeah, no, I pointed at the fact there is a question more. But yes, I think that the fact is that in Italy there's often the view that if you get killed, there is something in your life before that motivates that fact. So the first thing, and I'm not saying that this is correct, or seldom at least. But the fact is that in order to discover, in order to understand who is the person that killed you, first I have to understand who were you. And if I understand in which way you offended the moral, the grounds of the society, the more is probable that I get close to the truth. Because a crime is usually a response to a deviation from an equilibrium. You have done something that has gone too far, or you haven't done something as a response to something that has gone too far, and then you get eliminated. So before, the first thing to do is to understand in which way you behaved to someone in an incorrect way. And this is very interesting because you often discover that the moral of the person is very, very different with respect that if they are looking at their self or at someone else. I can do very nasty things, but of course I do it for survival. While if you do something a little less nastier than me, you're really a bad guy.
Yeah, so. Well,
it's a question of point of view.
And what you're talking about and what you bring up, you see, I think it's integral. And what I would just want to address is it's the basic thing about crime fiction. It's about breaking the social moral code. That's what it's about, and that's what Marco is talking about. And in his book, which is a small town crime where a bunch of people have to come to terms with it and figure it out. And Cheryl's, this collection of stories does deal with it on a kind of global level in terms of her country. But I do think that the sort of nexus of where all crime fiction comes together is about breaking the moral code of any society, and so I think, how can it not be, right? So there was...
Well, sometimes it's the writer who breaks the code. And I'm wondering how, I haven't read either of your books, I apologize for that, but I keep thinking of Donna Leon, who wrote about Italy and I believe still is not published in Italian.
Donna Leon?
Is that true? You know
No.
her?
No, she's not published.
She was very, very, very popular in Germany first. She lives in Venice.
I believe it's her choice.
Well, I think this story I've always heard is that, maybe I'm wrong about this, maybe the story's wrong, that she is not published in Italy because she knows Italians would be very upset with her criticisms of Italy.
I don't think so.
Well, in Italy,
We are very used.
well, if you criticize Italy in Italy, you've got a huge success.
I just...
Why wouldn't she want to be published in Italy then?
She's afraid.
What?
She's afraid. She's afraid that the Italians will think that she doesn't know Italy enough.
You see, this does come down, it comes back to that question that none of us can really answer, nobody answered, which has to do with self-censorship, the larger issue about what we write about, what we choose to write about. But you know, all art is about choices anyway. It's always about choices. I mean, you're making a choice every time you write a sentence and what you choose to write about and all the moral issues. I'm just going to put in a plug and then we'll have a last question. But you know, all what crime fiction does is it deals with this moral order. One of the reasons why I think it's clear that people love crime fiction is that it rips the world apart and then it puts it back together for you, you know, so that you go along with this terrible ride. I mean, you know, most people are quite disappointed when the ending doesn't put it back, the world back together for you, right? So is there anyone who has a left?
Sorry,
You disagree with me
no,
totally?
I disagree, but I think I found a way to connect these
Oh,
two
good,
questions.
great.
Crime fiction is very often about breaking the social order and discovering that the moral order and the social order are two separate things, two very different things. And I think that the continental writers are very in tune with that, that there is a distinction between the moral order or morality and the rules and regulations according to which society functions. And perhaps that disparity, this is certainly not true of the great classic noir authors, American authors, but more contemporary authors, that disparity between social order and moral order is not quite so dramatic. It's not quite so distant.
Actually, that is such a provocative statement and question that I kind of feel like we need a whole night or a symposium about it, you know, because it brings up so many issues about morality versus what the society will stand for, you know, or what we do. And I do think, though, that crime fiction pushes both of those things around. I mean, well, let me just ask both of the writers before you can go over and have a drink with them and buy their book and chat with them, how you feel about, let's see if you can say something more to that issue about morality versus the society.
Well, it's in Italy there's a very strange way of behaving. That's it's usually accepted, even if not with glory, of course, to behave differently to one of your friends with respect to an unknown person, even when you face very serious law and order issues. With respect to one of your friends, you usually behave differently. So, your social role, the kind and the number of friends you have bias heavily the way in which you are considered from a moral point of view. If you're involved in politics, high-level politics, it is common sense that you cannot be perfectly honest at all. It's impossible to arrive that kind of level being perfectly and crystal clear. It's commonly accepted, and I hope it's not absolutely true, but it's common sense that. So it is commonly accepted, commonly believed that there is this difference, and that breaking this difference, that is, behaving exactly as the law wants to one of your closest friends, would be right for what concerns the law, but unforgettable and unforgivable as a human being. So this separates heavily these two roads.
Yeah. Sure.
Causes problems.
Well, in Singapore, as you might guess, social order, the social code is hugely important. And you know, everyone just basically tries to uphold it as much as they can. You know, the government has all these laws in place, and everyone tries to look for warning signs. So before someone goes off, you know, and does something really terrible, you know, you're caught at step one. And so when something bad does happen, you know, there's a lot of sort of hammering over it and discussion for many, many years. And when and I guess that's probably, it goes back to what I was talking about earlier, why that's not really come out as much in, there's not been a lot of violence in fiction in Singapore. You know, partly because people are trying to adhere to that social code in a way, by perhaps not talking about it as much. So I don't know if I'm probably not answering.
No, I think that, I think you've actually answered the question, and it is a question that is filled with ambiguity, and I think, you know, as I said, I'd like to keep going with it, but we won't tonight. But I will ask you to please join us for a drink. I always say the same thing, which is that you should buy a book, you should support books, you should have it signed. It might be a relic very soon. Never mind, I was going to get into a current thing in our news, but I'm not going to. So please join us, and thank you, Cheryl Tan and Mark Malvaldi. Thank you.